The bear's hot breath clouded the mountain air between them, and Katherine Finley knew with absolute certainty that she was about to die just 3 feet from a basket of wild blackberries that would never make it into her aunt's kitchen. She had come to Nevada, Missouri, in the spring of 1878, with nothing but a worn carpetbag and the address of an aunt she had never met, fleeing the ash-gray memories of consumption that had taken her parents within 6 months of each other back in Pennsylvania. The telegram she had sent ahead arrived 2 weeks after she did, which meant Aunt Margaret's face had been a portrait of confusion when Katherine knocked on her door with mud on her hem and desperation in her eyes. But blood was blood, and the older woman had taken her in without question, given her the small room under the eaves, and put her to work in the boarding house that had been Margaret's livelihood since her own husband died in the war. Nevada sat in the western part of Missouri, close enough to the Kansas border that you could smell the different quality of dust when the wind blew right. It was a town that had survived the border wars and the chaos that followed, rebuilt itself with determination and stubbornness, and now served as a supply stop for ranchers, farmers, and the occasional trapper or mountain man coming down from the high country to trade furs and restock provisions. The boarding house did steady business, and Katherine had fallen into the rhythm of it over the past 8 months, washing linens, helping with meals, serving breakfast to weathered men who smelled of horses and hard work. She'd been picking berries in the foothills about 2 miles outside of town, in a spot that Aunt Margaret swore produced the sweetest blackberries in 3 counties. It was late August, and the heat pressed down like a heavy quilt, making the shadows under the oak trees a blessed relief. Katherine had been humming something her mother used to sing, her fingers stained purple, her basket half full when she heard the rustling. At first, she thought it was a deer. Then she saw the dark mass of fur, the powerful shoulders, the way branches snapped like kindling under its weight. The black bear was enormous, easily 400 pounds, and it had caught the scent of the berries she had already picked, its small eyes fixed on her with an intelligence that made her blood turn to ice water. She froze. Everything she had ever heard about bears collided in her mind at once. Run, do not run, make yourself big, play dead, climb a tree, never climb a tree. Her throat closed around a scream that would not come. The bear took a step forward, then another, its massive head swaying slightly as it tested the air. Then a figure moved between them so fast Katherine thought at first she was hallucinating from fear. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, with hair the color of dark honey falling past his collar and a beard that suggested he had not seen a barber in months. He wore buckskin pants and a shirt that had once been blue, and in his hands he held nothing but a long walking stick and a knife at his belt. He did not run toward the bear or away from it. He simply stood there, solid as a mountain himself, taking up space between her and certain death. "Get back," he said, his voice low and steady. Katherine could not tell if he was talking to her or the bear. The bear rose up on its hind legs, and Katherine heard a sound escape her throat that was half sob, half prayer. The man did not move. He spread his arms slightly, making himself larger, and began speaking in a low, continuous rumble that was not quite words and not quite growling. The sound of it vibrated in Katherine's chest, and she realized with distant wonder that he was communicating with the creature. The standoff lasted an eternity compressed into 60 seconds. The bear dropped to all fours, huffed once, then swung its massive head from side to side. The man took one careful step forward. The bear backed up, another step, another retreat. The man's voice never changed pitch or volume, that low, steady rumble continuing like water over stones. And slowly, impossibly, the bear turned and lumbered back into the dense underbrush, crashing through the foliage until the sound faded entirely. Katherine's legs gave out. She sat down hard on the forest floor, her basket tipping over and spilling berries across the dried leaves and pine needles. The man turned around, and she saw his face properly for the first time. He was younger than his beard suggested, probably not yet 30, with eyes the color of winter moss and a scar that cut through his left eyebrow. His face was weathered in the way of men who live under open sky, but there was something gentle in the way he looked at her, something that did not match the raw power she had just witnessed. "You hurt?" he asked. Katherine shook her head, not trusting her voice. "Good. That is good." He walked over and crouched down beside her, moving slowly as if she were a spooked animal herself, Up close, she could see the breadth of his shoulders, the way his shirt stretched across a chest built from years of hard living, the thick muscles in his forearms below his rolled-up sleeves. He smelled like pine smoke and leather and something wild she could not name. "You should not be out here alone." "I know," Katherine managed, her voice coming out smaller than she wanted. I did not know about the bears. They are drawn to berries this time of year, fattening up for winter." He began picking up her spilled fruit, his large hands surprisingly careful as he returned each berry to her basket. "You from the town?" "Yes, Nevada. I live at the boarding house with my aunt." He nodded, still collecting berries. "That would be Margaret's place. I know it." "Do you?" Katherine found her strength returning now that her heart was no longer trying to beat its way out of her chest. "I have not seen you there. I do not come to town much, only when I need to." He handed her the basket, now refilled as much as possible, though they had lost perhaps a third of her morning's work. "Quentin Walker. Most folks call me the Mountain Man if they call me anything." "Katherine Finley." She took the basket and their fingers brushed. Even through her shock, she felt the calluses on his hands, the strength in them. "Thank you. You saved my life. The bear might have just taken your berries and left you alone. But you did not know that. You still stepped between us." Quentin stood and offered her his hand. Katherine took it and let him pull her to her feet. He was at least 6 inches taller than her own 5.5 feet, and standing this close to him was like standing next to something carved from oak and iron. She had seen plenty of men in the boarding house, but none quite like this, none who seemed to carry the wilderness itself in the set of their shoulders. "Where is your horse?" he asked. "I walked." 2 miles with a bear in these woods?" He shook his head. "I will walk you back." "You do not have to do that." "I do." There was no arguing with the simple certainty in his voice. They walked in silence for the first 10 minutes, Katherine acutely aware of his presence beside her, the way he moved through the forest like he was part of it, barely making a sound, while her own footsteps seemed to announce themselves to every creature in 5 miles. He had picked up a rifle that had been leaning against a tree, which explained where he had come from. He must have been hunting. "Did I ruin your hunt?" Katherine asked finally, unable to bear the quiet any longer. "No, I already got what I came for. Deer, about a mile back. I will collect it on my way up the mountain." "You live in the mountains?" "I do. Have a cabin about 8 miles north and east of here, up where the trees get thick and the people get scarce." "That sounds lonely." He glanced at her, something flickering in those green eyes. "It is quiet. That's not the same thing as lonely." Katherine considered this. "I suppose not. Though I think I would find it lonely. I have only been in Nevada for 8 months, and already I cannot imagine not hearing other people around me." "Where are you from originally?" "Pennsylvania. My parents died, both of them. I had nowhere else to go, so I came here to my mother's sister." "I'm sorry about your parents." The words were simple, but the sincerity in them was unmistakable. "Thank you. It was hard, but Aunt Margaret has been kind. The work keeps me busy, and busy helps." "It does." They emerged from the tree line onto the dirt road that led back into Nevada. In the distance, Katherine could see the church steeple rising above the other buildings, the American flag hanging limp in the still air above the general store. A wagon was coming toward them, kicking up dust, and as it passed, the driver tipped his hat to Katherine and gave Quentin a long, curious look. "People will talk," Katherine said, "if they see us together. People always talk, especially in small towns. Does that not bother you?" "No." Quentin adjusted the rifle on his shoulder. "Should it bother you?" Katherine thought about it. She was 20 years old, unmarried, with no prospects that her aunt had not already tried to manufacture through awkward Sunday dinners with the banker's nephew or the minister's cousin. None of those men had interested her beyond being polite company. None of them had stepped between her and a bear. "No," she said finally. "I suppose it should not." They reached the boarding house just as the church bells were ringing noon. Aunt Margaret was on the front porch, sweeping with more vigor than the dustless boards required, which meant she had seen them coming and was making a show of being too busy to stare. Katherine stopped at the gate and turned to Quentin. "Thank you again, Mr. Walker, for everything." "Just Quentin." "And you are welcome, Miss Finley." "Just Katherine." He smiled then, a slow thing that transformed his serious face into something that made Catherine's stomach do a peculiar flip. "Catherine, be careful in the woods, and maybe take someone with you next time." "I will." He touched 2 fingers to his forehead in a casual salute and turned to head back toward the forest. Catherine watched him go, still holding her basket of half-spilled berries, until Aunt Margaret's voice cut through her reverie. "Katherine Finley, you get in this house this instant and tell me everything." The next week passed in a strange haze. Catherine went about her duties at the boarding house, scrubbing floors and changing linens and serving meals. But her mind kept drifting back to those moments in the forest. The way Quentin had moved, the certainty in his actions, the gentle care he had taken in collecting her spilled berries. Aunt Margaret had listened to the whole story with wide eyes and then delivered a lecture about the dangers of the wilderness that Catherine barely heard. What she did hear was the grudging admission that Quentin Walker had a good reputation for a recluse. He paid his bills when he came to town, did not drink to excess, and had once helped pull the blacksmith's boy from the river when the ice broke 5 winters back. "But he is wild, Catherine," Aunt Margaret had said, her weathered hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. "He lives up there alone, barely comes down. That is no life for a woman." Catherine had not asked why that mattered, but she thought about it. She thought about it while she kneaded bread dough. She thought about it while she hung laundry on the line behind the house. She thought about it while she served breakfast to a pair of ranch hands who argued about horses and weather with equal passion. 10 days after the bear incident, Quentin Walker walked into the boarding house dining room during the lunch service. Catherine was carrying a tray of dishes back to the kitchen when she saw him standing just inside the doorway, looking profoundly uncomfortable amid the flowered wallpaper and lace curtains. He had trimmed his beard slightly and was wearing a clean shirt, though his pants were still buckskin, and his boots were made for mountain trails, not dining rooms. His eyes found hers across the room, and something in her chest seized up like a fist closing. "Catherine," he said, his voice carrying that same low steadiness she remembered. Several of the diners turned to look. She set down the tray before she dropped it. "Quentin, this is a surprise. I was in town for supplies, thought I would stop by." He shifted his weight, and Catherine realized with a start that he was nervous. This man who had faced down a bear without flinching was nervous in her aunt's boarding house. "I wondered if you might take a walk with me, if you have time." Aunt Margaret materialized from the kitchen like a summoned spirit. "Catherine is working." "Aunt Margaret." "However," the older woman continued, her sharp eyes assessing Quentin from head to boots, "I suppose we can spare her for half an hour. But you stay on the main streets where people can see you. No wandering off." "Yes, madam," Quentin said solemnly. Catherine untied her apron with shaking hands and hung it on the hook by the kitchen door. She was wearing a simple brown dress that had belonged to her mother, the cuffs carefully mended where they had started to fray. Not exactly the outfit she would have chosen if she had known Quentin Walker was going to appear, but there was nothing to be done about it now. They walked out into the August afternoon, the heat still pressing down though it was past its worst. Quentin offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, Catherine took it. The muscle beneath her hand was solid as stone, and she was suddenly very aware of how much power was contained in this quiet man. "How have you been?" Quentin asked as they turned onto Main Street, passing the general store and the feed depot. "Well, busy. Aunt Margaret always finds work that needs doing." "She seems like a good woman." "She is. Stern but kind underneath." Catherine glanced up at him. "How have you been? How's the mountain?" "Still there." A hint of humor warmed his voice. "I brought down the deer hide and meat to trade. Got some coffee and flour and other supplies. Saw you had taken the berries in, so I figured the bear did not come back for you." "You were checking on me?" "I was asking about you at the general store. Just wanted to make sure." Something warm unfurled in Catherine's chest. They walked past the church, where Reverend Thompson was examining a shutter that hung askew. He called out a greeting, and they both responded, but kept walking. Catherine could feel the weight of eyes on them from various windows and porches. Aunt Margaret was right. People would talk. Let them, she thought with sudden defiance. "Catherine," Quentin said as they reached the far end of town, where the buildings gave way to prairie grass and the road stretched toward distant farms. "I need to be honest with you about why I came today." Her heart started that peculiar hammering again. "All right." I have not been able to stop thinking about you since that day in the woods. I know that probably sounds strange since we barely know each other, but it is the truth." He stopped walking and turned to face her, his green eyes serious. "I live a simple life up in those mountains. I hunt, I trap, I keep to myself mostly. It is a good life, but it is a solitary one. I never minded that before. But then I met you, and now the cabin feels emptier than it used to." Catherine's breath caught. "Quentin." "I am not asking you for anything," he continued. "I just wanted you to know. And I wanted to ask if maybe I could call on you proper, if your aunt allows it. Come to town more often. Get to know you better. See if maybe what I'm feeling is something you might feel too, given time." She should have been cautious. She should have demurred and said she needed time to think. But Katherine had spent 8 months being cautious, had spent years before that watching her parents die slowly, had built walls around herself that were supposed to protect her from more loss. And here was this man, this wild, gentle, impossibly brave man, offering her something real and honest. "Yes," she said, "I would like that very much." The smile that spread across Quentin's face was worth every tongue that would wag, every eyebrow that would raise. He took her hand in his, careful of his strength, and Katherine felt that now familiar sense of safety that came from being near him. "I should warn you," she said, trying to keep her voice light though her emotions were a tempest. "Aunt Margaret will interrogate you thoroughly. She will want to know your intentions and your prospects, and probably your entire family history. I can handle that. And the town gossips will have us married by Sunday. Let them. And I have never courted anyone before, not really, so I might be terrible at it. I doubt that very much." Quentin's thumb brushed across her knuckles. "And I have never courted anyone either, so we will figure it out together." They stood there for a moment, just holding hands at the edge of town while the prairie grass whispered around them and the sky stretched blue and infinite overhead. Then, because Aunt Margaret had specified half an hour and was surely timing it, they turned and walked back toward the boarding house, and Katherine felt something she had not felt since before her parents got sick. Hope. Quentin came to town every Sunday after that. He would arrive in the morning, clean-shaven and as presentable as a mountain man could make himself, and sit through the church service beside Katherine and Aunt Margaret in the third pew from the back. Reverend Thompson seemed pleased to have him there, though the older ladies of the congregation whispered behind their fans and watched Katherine with undisguised curiosity. After the service, Quentin would take Katherine walking, always properly, always within sight of others, but those walks became the center of Katherine's week. She learned about his life in pieces. He'd grown up in Kentucky, left home at 16 after his father died, and his mother remarried a man who did not want stepchildren around. He had worked his way west, doing whatever jobs needed doing, until he found the Missouri mountains and a piece of land that spoke to him. He built his cabin with his own hands, every log and shingle, and he had lived there for 6 years now, mostly alone except for the occasional visit from other trappers passing through. "Does it ever frighten you?" Katherine asked one afternoon, as they sat by the small creek that ran behind the church. "Being so isolated?" "No more than crowds frighten me," Quentin said. He was whittling a piece of wood, his knife moving with practiced precision. "Everyone is afraid of something. What are you afraid of?" He was quiet for a long moment, wood shavings falling into his lap. "Losing things that matter. I had that happen enough when I was young. I think that is why I live simple now. Fewer things to lose." Katherine understood that bone deep. "But does that not also mean fewer things to hold on to?" "It does." He set down his whittling and looked at her. "I'm starting to think maybe I've been playing it too safe." The leaves began to turn in late September, painting the mountains in shades of amber and crimson. Quentin still came every Sunday, but now he sometimes came on Wednesday afternoons too, helping Aunt Margaret with repairs around the boarding house that her aging hands struggled with. He fixed the loose shutter on the second floor, repaired the gate that had been hanging crooked, chopped enough firewood to see them through 2 winters. Aunt Margaret, who had been skeptical at first, warmed to him incrementally. "He is a good worker," she admitted to Katherine one evening as they prepared supper, "and he looks at you like you are the sun itself." Katherine felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Aunt Margaret, it is true. I see the way you look at him too, girl, like he hung the moon just for you." The older woman's face softened. Your mother would have wanted you to be happy. And if that mountain man makes you happy, then I suppose I can live with you courting him. Thank you, Aunt Margaret. But if he hurts you, I will take a skillet to him, you understand? I understand. In October, Quentin asked Katherine if she would like to see his cabin. With your aunt's permission, he added quickly, and maybe she could come along to keep it proper. Aunt Margaret considered this for a full day before agreeing, but only if they brought the minister's wife, Mrs. Thompson, as an additional chaperone. So on a crisp Saturday morning, the four of them set out in Quentin's wagon, following the trails up into the mountains. Katherine had never been this far from town, and she stared in wonder at the landscape unfolding around them. Tall pines reaching for the sky, rocky outcroppings where hawks circled, valleys carpeted in wildflowers going to seed. The cabin, when they reached it, took Katherine's breath away. It was small but solid, built with obvious care in a clearing surrounded by trees. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, and there was a covered porch where furs were stretched on frames to dry. Inside, it was one large room with a sleeping loft, a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table and chairs, and shelves lined with supplies. Everything was neat and organized, the floor swept clean, the furs on the bed tucked tight. You built all of this yourself? Katherine asked, running her hand along a windowsill that had been sanded smooth. Every bit of it. Quentin stood in the doorway, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. It is not much. It is wonderful. Aunt Margaret and Mrs. Thompson were examining the herb bundles hanging from the rafters, exclaiming over Quentin's neat stitchwork on a pair of moccasins. Katherine moved to the window and looked out at the view, mountains rolling away in every direction, the world vast and wild and beautiful. She could understand why he loved it here. Could you be happy in a place like this? Quentin asked quietly, coming to stand beside her. Katherine turned to look at him. They had been courting for 2 months now, and she knew the shape of his character as well as she knew the shape of his face. She knew his gentleness with wounded creatures, the way he always helped anyone who needed it, his quiet humor, his unwavering honesty. She knew the way his presence made her feel safe and seen and cherished. She knew that she had fallen in love with him somewhere between the bear in the woods and this moment in his handmade cabin. Yes, she said simply. I could. His hand found hers, their fingers intertwining. Even though it means leaving town, leaving your aunt? Aunt Margaret raised 3 children and sent them all out into the world. She knows how to let go. Katherine squeezed his hand. And it is only 8 miles. I could still visit. Katherine Finley, Quentin said, his voice rough with emotion. Are you saying what I think you are saying? That depends on what you are asking. He glanced over his shoulder at Aunt Margaret and Mrs. Thompson, who were suddenly very interested in the view from the other window, then back at Katherine. I'm asking if you would consider marrying me, if you would consider making a life up here, with me. I know it is fast, and I know I do not have much to offer, beyond this cabin and my 2 hands and everything I am, but I love you. I have loved you since you sat in those leaves covered in berry juice and did not fall apart, and I would spend every day of my life making sure you never regretted saying yes. Katherine's eyes filled with tears, the good kind that came from joy too big to contain. Then yes. Yes, I will marry you, Quentin Walker. He kissed her then, with Aunt Margaret and Mrs. Thompson as witnesses, a kiss that was both gentle and fierce, that tasted like promises and pine smoke, and coming home. When they finally pulled apart, both somewhat breathless, Aunt Margaret was dabbing at her eyes with her handkerchief. Well, the older woman said with mock sternness, I suppose we need to start planning a wedding. They were married 6 weeks later in the little church in Nevada on a cold November morning with snow threatening in the gray sky. Katherine wore a dress that had been her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and carried a bouquet of dried wildflowers that Quentin had collected from the mountains. Quentin wore new pants and a jacket that Aunt Margaret had insisted on buying him, though he drew the line at a tie. Half the town turned out for the ceremony, curious to see the mountain man getting married, but Katherine barely saw them. She only saw Quentin, standing at the altar with his hand outstretched, waiting for her. Reverend Thompson performed the service, his voice warm with genuine happiness for them both. When it came time for the vows, Quentin spoke his clearly and firmly, his green eyes never leaving Katherine's face. And when she spoke her own vows, promising to love him in plenty and in want, In sickness and in health, for all the days of her life. She meant every word. They had a small reception at the boarding house with cake that Aunt Margaret had baked and cider that the general store owner donated. People congratulated them, offered advice, promised to pray for their happiness. And then, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Quentin helped Katherine into the wagon, her few possessions already loaded in the back, and they began the journey up to the cabin that was now her home. The first snowflakes started falling as they climbed higher into the mountains. Katherine sat close to Quentin on the wagon seat, wrapped in a thick shawl and a bearskin that had been his wedding gift to her. Not the bear from that day in August, he had assured her, but one he had traded for. She leaned against his solid warmth and watched the world transform into something magical as snow began to cover everything in white. "No regrets?" Quentin asked as the cabin came into view. "Not a single one." He had spent the past week preparing for her arrival. Inside, the cabin was warm from a fire he had built before leaving for the ceremony. There were new curtains on the windows, made from fabric he had bought in town and sewn himself with stitches that were more functional than pretty. There was a new rocking chair by the fireplace. There were wildflowers in a jar on the table, their dried petals still bright despite the cold. "Welcome home, Mrs. Walker," Quentin said, lifting her down from the wagon. Katherine looked up at him, at this strong, gentle man who had literally stepped between her and death, who had courted her with patience and honesty, who had just pledged his life to hers. "I love you," she said. "I love you too." He kissed her forehead. "Now let me get you inside before we both freeze." That first winter in the mountains taught Katherine more than she had learned in all her years before. She learned how to read the weather and the weight of the air, how to tell when snow was coming by the way the birds behaved. She learned how to cure meat, how to tan hides, how to make soap from ash and fat. Quentin was a patient teacher, never frustrated when she made mistakes, always ready to show her again until she understood. But she taught him things too. She taught him how to make bread that did not come out like rocks, how to organize supplies so you could find them in the dark, how to mend clothes so they lasted twice as long. She taught him songs from her childhood, and sometimes in the evenings he would ask her to sing while he worked on carving or repairing traps. She taught him that the loneliness he had accepted as part of his life was not inevitable, that sharing the cabin made it feel larger, not smaller. They fell into rhythms together. Mornings, Quentin would rise before dawn to check his trap lines, and Katherine would make breakfast and prepare whatever needed doing that day. Afternoons might mean hunting together, her learning to track and move quietly through the forest, or processing hides, or gathering firewood. Evenings they spent by the fireplace, talking or reading from the 2 books they owned, or simply sitting in comfortable silence while the wind howled outside. On Sundays, weather permitting, they would make the journey down to Nevada for church and to visit Aunt Margaret. Katherine would help with the boarding house for a few hours, catching up on town gossip and news, while Quentin handled any errands that needed doing. Then they would make the journey back up the mountain, Katherine always glad to return to their snug cabin, to the life they were building together. The snow deepened as December arrived, drifts piling against the cabin walls and coating the pine trees in heavy white. One morning, Katherine woke feeling ill, barely making it outside before she was sick in the snow. Quentin hovered anxiously, but she waved him off. "It is probably something I ate," she said, but the next morning it happened again, and the morning after that. It was Aunt Margaret during one of their Sunday visits who took one look at Katherine's face and pulled her aside into the kitchen. "Girl, when did you last have your monthly courses?" Katherine started to answer, and then stopped, counting back in her head. Her eyes widened. I'm not sure. I've been so busy I did not notice." Aunt Margaret's stern expression softened into something approaching delight. "Katherine, child, I think you are carrying a baby." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Katherine sat down heavily in one of the kitchen chairs. A baby. She and Quentin had only been married for 2 months, but of course it was possible. More than possible, given how much they loved each other. A baby. "Are you all right?" Aunt Margaret asked, concerned now. "I think so. I'm just surprised." Katherine looked up at her aunt. "What do I do?" "First, you tell that husband of yours. Then you take care of yourself. No heavy lifting, plenty of rest. And you come see me every week so I can make sure you are doing well. I helped birth half the babies in this county. I can certainly help with my own great niece or nephew." Telling Quentin was both terrifying and wonderful. They were in the wagon heading back up the mountain, the late afternoon sun turning the snow golden, when Katherine finally gathered her courage. "Quentin, I need to tell you something." He must have heard something in her voice because he immediately pulled the horses to a stop and turned to face her, concern etched in his features. "What is wrong? Are you ill? Should we go back?" "No, nothing is wrong. At least, I do not think it is wrong." Katherine took a deep breath. "Aunt Margaret thinks I'm going to have a baby." For a moment, Quentin just stared at her, his face completely blank. Then understanding dawned, followed by an expression of such pure joy that it made Katherine's heart squeeze. "A baby? You're sure?" "Not completely sure, but fairly sure. I have all the signs Aunt Margaret mentioned." "A baby?" Quentin said it like he was testing out the word. Then he laughed, a sound of delight that echoed across the snowy landscape, and pulled Katherine into his arms. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Katherine asked, even though she could feel the answer in the way he held her. Happy does not even begin to cover it. He pulled back to look at her face. "Are you happy?" "I am. Scared too, but happy." "We will figure it out together," Quentin promised, "just like we figure out everything else." The winter deepened, and Katherine's belly began to swell with new life. Quentin became even more protective than usual, insisting she rest more, refusing to let her do any heavy work. He had always been attentive, but now he anticipated her every need before she could voice it. A cup of tea appearing at her elbow, an extra blanket tucked around her shoulders, her feet propped up on a stool before she realized they were aching. The isolation of the mountain, which Katherine had grown to love, became more challenging as her pregnancy progressed. The weekly trips to town became impossible once the deep snows of January arrived, and for 6 weeks they were completely cut off from the outside world. Quentin assured her it would be fine, that women had been having babies in remote places since the beginning of time, but Katherine could see the worry in his eyes. "If anything goes wrong," she said one night as they lay in bed, her hand on her rounded stomach where the baby was kicking, "promise me you will save the baby first." "Katherine, do not talk like that. Promise me, Quentin." "No." His voice was firm. "I will not promise that because nothing is going to go wrong. And if something does, I am not choosing between you and this baby. We are going to be smart and careful and prepared." True to his word, Quentin spent the next weeks preparing. He read every medical book he could get his hands on during their last trip to town. He laid in extra supplies. He made sure they had plenty of firewood, plenty of food, plenty of everything they might need. And when the first thaw came in late February, he brought Aunt Margaret up to the cabin to stay with them until after the baby arrived. "I am too old for all this climbing," Aunt Margaret complained as she descended from the wagon, but her eyes were bright as she looked around the cabin. "You have made a good home here, Katherine." "We both have," Katherine said, glancing at Quentin. The baby came in early April, when the snow was finally melting and the first wildflowers were pushing up through the soggy ground. Katherine's labor started just before dawn, a cramping pain that woke her from sleep. Quentin was immediately alert, and Aunt Margaret took charge of the situation with the confidence of long experience. It was not an easy labor. As the sun climbed higher and then began to descend again, Katherine began to understand why women spoke of childbirth in hushed, reverent tones. The pain was beyond anything she had imagined, waves of it that left her gasping and crying out. Quentin stayed beside her the whole time, letting her grip his hands hard enough to bruise, whispering encouragements, wiping her forehead with cool cloths. "You can do this," he kept saying. "You are the bravest person I know. You can do this." And finally, as the sun was setting and painting the cabin walls gold, Katherine gave one final desperate push and heard the most beautiful sound in the world, her baby crying. Aunt Margaret worked quickly and then placed a small, squirming bundle into Katherine's arms. "You have a son," her aunt said, her voice thick with emotion. Katherine stared down at the tiny face, the dark hair plastered to the small head, the miniature fingers that were already curling around her thumb. A son. She and Quentin had a son. "Let me see him," Quentin said hoarsely, and Katherine angled the baby so he could see. The expression on her husband's face was something she would remember for the rest of her life. Wonder and terror and love all mixed together. "He is perfect," Quentin whispered. He is, Katherine agreed. They named him James after Quentin's father, James Walker, born in a cabin in the Missouri mountains with mountains in his blood and love surrounding him. He was a healthy baby, loud and hungry and determined, and he changed everything. The cabin that had been quiet, now filled with his cries, his coos, his existence. Quentin proved to be a natural father, gentle with the baby despite his large hands, patient through the long nights when James would not sleep, devoted in a way that made Katherine love him even more. Aunt Margaret stayed for 2 weeks after the birth, making sure Katherine recovered properly and teaching both new parents the basics of baby care. Then she returned to town, promising to come back soon and making them promise to bring James down for a visit once Katherine was strong enough. That first year of parenthood was exhausting and magical in equal measure. Katherine learned to function on little sleep, to nurse the baby while preparing food with her free hand, to recognize what each different cry meant. Quentin adapted their routines to include James, building a cradle that rocked with a pull of a rope, fashioning a carrier so Katherine could keep the baby close while she worked, taking the night watch when Katherine was too exhausted to move. They brought James down to Nevada when he was 3 months old, and half the town turned out to see the mountain man's baby. James was passed from person to person, exclaimed over, blessed by Reverend Thompson, and thoroughly spoiled by Aunt Margaret. Katherine watched it all with a mixture of pride and anxiety, eager to get back to the quiet of the mountain where it was just the three of them. The seasons turned. James grew, sitting up, then crawling, then pulling himself up on furniture, and taking tottering steps. Katherine and Quentin marveled at each new development, each tiny accomplishment. The cabin that had seemed spacious for 2 felt cozy with 3, but they made it work. When James was 18 months old, Katherine realized she was pregnant again. This time, she was not surprised by the signs, and when she told Quentin, his reaction was joy tempered with experience. They knew what was coming now, both the challenges and the rewards. Their daughter was born in November, just after the first snow. The labor was shorter this time, and when Aunt Margaret placed the baby in Katherine's arms, she felt that same overwhelming rush of love that she had felt with James. "A daughter," Quentin said, and there were tears in his eyes. "We have a daughter." They named her Sarah after Katherine's mother. Sarah Walker, born as the mountain settled into winter's grip, with her father's green eyes and her mother's determination evident from the start. The cabin was definitely too small now. That spring, as soon as the weather allowed, Quentin began work on an addition. He worked on it every spare moment, and Katherine helped when she could, holding boards while he nailed them in place or watching the children while he cut timbers. By the time Sarah was 6 months old, they had a second room, a proper bedroom where she and Quentin could sleep while the children took over the loft. Life in the mountains continued, harder now with 2 small children, but rich in ways Katherine could never have imagined back when she was picking berries in that clearing. She had a family now, a real family, built from love and choice and daily commitment. Every morning she woke to the sound of James chattering to his sister, to the smell of coffee Quentin had already started, to sunlight streaming through windows that looked out on mountains that had become home. The children grew. James became a serious little boy who followed his father everywhere, learning to track and hunt and read the weather. Sarah was wilder, more likely to be found trying to climb trees or catching frogs by the creek. Katherine taught them both to read from her mother's Bible and the few other books they had, and Quentin taught them the ways of the forest, how to move quietly, how to respect the wilderness, how to find their way home. When James was 7 and Sarah was 5, they adopted a dog, a half-wild animal that Quentin found injured on one of his trap lines. The children named him Bear, which Katherine found darkly amusing given how she and Quentin had met. Bear became part of the family, following the children on their adventures, sleeping beside the fireplace at night, alerting them to any danger. Katherine was 28 when she realized she was pregnant for the 3rd time. She and Quentin discussed whether the cabin could handle another person, whether they could manage another child while James and Sarah still demanded so much attention. But in the end, the decision made itself. This baby was coming whether they were ready or not. Their second son was born in July, delivered by Katherine herself with only Quentin to help, as Aunt Margaret had taken ill and could not make the journey. It was terrifying, relying only on each other and the knowledge they had gained from previous births. But everything went smoothly. The baby was small but healthy, and when Katherine held him for the first time, with James and Sarah crowding close to see their new brother, she felt a completeness she had not known was missing. They named him Thomas, and he completed their family in ways Katherine had not expected. Thomas was easygoing where his siblings had been demanding, content where they had been restless. He seemed to bring a new calm to the household, and even Bear seemed to gentle around him. The years flowed like the creek behind the cabin, each season bringing its own rhythm. James grew tall and strong like his father, shoulders broadening as he entered his teenage years. Sarah remained fierce and independent, but developed a tender side when dealing with her younger brother. Thomas grew from baby to boy, curious about everything, always asking questions. Quentin added another room to the cabin when it became clear that James needed his own space, then another when Sarah demanded the same. The cabin sprawled now, not elegant but functional, every board a testament to their growing family. They had also built a larger barn for the horse and cow they had acquired over the years, and a smokehouse for preserving meat. Katherine's life had become everything she never knew she wanted. The boarding house in Nevada seemed like a dream from someone else's life, though they still visited Aunt Margaret regularly. The old woman was in her 70s now, had sold the boarding house and moved in with the minister and his wife, but she was still sharp as ever and loved seeing her great nieces and nephews. On a day in late summer when Katherine was 34, she and Quentin took a rare moment alone together. The children were all down at the creek with Bear, their laughter echoing up through the trees. Katherine and Quentin sat on the porch he had built years ago, watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of amber and rose. "Do you ever miss it?" Quentin asked. "Town life? Living somewhere easier?" Katherine thought about the question seriously, as she always did with Quentin. "Sometimes I miss the convenience, being able to walk to a store when we need something, having neighbors close by. But miss that life? No, this is where I belong. Even when the winters are hard?" "Even then," she leaned against him, his arm coming around her automatically. "Do you ever regret that day with the bear? If you had just let it take my berries and walked away, your life would have been simpler." "Katherine Walker, that is the most ridiculous thing you have ever said." Quentin tilted her face up to his. "That day with the bear was the luckiest day of my life. Everything good I have came from that moment. You, our children, this family. I would face down 100 bears to have this." "You might have to the way our children wander," Katherine said, but she was smiling. Then I will." He kissed her, soft and familiar, and still able to make her heart skip. Every single time. James was 17 when he brought home a girl from town, nervous and blushing as he introduced her to his parents. Her name was Mary, and she was the daughter of the blacksmith, and it was clear to Katherine within 5 minutes that her son was head over heels in love. She saw herself in Quentin in the way James looked at this girl, protective and tender and completely devoted. "Well," Quentin said that night after Mary had gone home and James had retreated to his room, "I suppose we will be building another cabin soon. He's only 17. I was younger when I built ours. That is different." "Is it?" Quentin pulled her close. "I seem to remember being young and in love and willing to do anything to make a life with the woman I loved." Katherine could not argue with that. And sure enough, within the year, James and Mary were married in the same church where Katherine and Quentin had wed 20 years earlier. Quentin helped his son build a cabin about a mile from their own, close enough for family but far enough for privacy. And when Mary gave birth to a baby girl 2 years later, making Katherine and Quentin grandparents at 38 and 40 respectively, Katherine held the tiny infant and marveled at the circle of it all. Sarah, true to her independent nature, announced at 16 that she wanted to become a teacher and needed to go to the school in Kansas City to get proper training. It was the first time one of their children had wanted to leave the mountain for something other than a trip to town, and Katherine's heart broke even as she supported the decision. "She will come back," Quentin assured her as they saw Sarah off on the stage, her trunk packed with everything she would need for her new life. "These mountains are in her blood." He was right. Sarah spent 3 years in Kansas City, earned her teaching certificate, and came home to open a small school in Nevada where she taught the children of the town and surrounding farms. She married at 22 to a farmer's son named David, and they built a house halfway between the mountain and town, close enough for Sarah to walk to the schoolhouse. Thomas, their youngest, was the one who truly had mountains in his blood. He had no interest in leaving, no desire for anything beyond the life his parents had built. At 15, he was already as skilled a tracker as his father, could shoot straighter than most men twice his age, and moved through the forest like he was part of it. Katherine watched him and saw Quentin as he must have been at that age, wild and capable and utterly at home in the wilderness. The seasons continued their dance. Catherine's hair began to show silver at the temples, and Quentin's beard went from honey brown to gray. They still made the journey to town for church most Sundays, though it took longer now, and they sometimes stayed over with Sarah and David rather than making the journey twice in 2 days. Aunt Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep at 78, and Katherine grieved, but also celebrated a life well lived, a woman who had given her a home when she had nowhere else to go. On a day in early autumn, when Katherine was 45 and Quentin 47, they took a walk together up to the ridge above their cabin. It was something they did sometimes when the children were busy with their own lives, this reclaiming of time together. The leaves were just starting to turn, and the air had that crisp quality that promised winter was coming. "Do you remember when I asked you if you could be happy here?" Quentin said as they stood looking out over the valley, at the cabin and the barn and the whole life they had built. "I remember. I said yes." "Were you right?" Katherine thought about everything that had happened in the 27 years since she had picked berries in a clearing and a bear had changed her life forever. She thought about the children she had carried and birthed and raised, the grandchildren who were starting to accumulate, the life she and Quentin had carved out of wilderness and love and determination. "I was right," she said, "though I did not know then just how happy I would be." "Neither did I." Quentin took her hand, the same gesture he had made 1,000 times over the years. "But I knew from that first day that you were someone special, someone worth stepping between a bear for." "Just a bear," Katherine teased. "Bears, mountain lions, outlaws, harsh winters, and anything else that might threaten you. Always." They stood there as the sun descended and the shadows lengthened, two people who had somehow found each other in the vastness of the wilderness and built something that would outlast them both. In the distance, they could see smoke rising from James and Mary's cabin, and from the valley they could hear Thomas calling the cow in for milking. This was their legacy, Katherine thought, not just the children and grandchildren, but this way of living, this commitment to each other and to the land and to building something real. As they walked back down to the cabin, Katherine remembered again that day with the berries and the bear. She had thought then that she was going to die. She had been wrong. That day had not been the end of anything. It had been the beginning of everything. Thomas, at 18, surprised everyone by bringing home a girl he had met while trading furs in town. Her name was Rebecca, and she was the daughter of a family that had recently moved to Nevada from Ohio. Unlike Mary, who had adapted to mountain life with some struggle, Rebecca took to it immediately. She'd grown up on a farm and was used to hard work, and she seemed to view the isolation of the mountains as an adventure rather than a hardship. "I like her," Katherine told Quentin after Rebecca's first visit. "I do too. She has good sense." Thomas and Rebecca married when Thomas was 19 and Rebecca was 18, and with Quentin and Thomas both working on it, they had a cabin built in 2 months. It was the smallest of the 3 family cabins, but snug and well made, situated near a spring that provided fresh water year-round. Katherine was 50 when she became a grandmother for the 4th time, holding Thomas and Rebecca's son and marveling at how the cycle continued. She thought about her own parents sometimes, wondered what they would think of the life she had built so far from Pennsylvania. She hoped they would be proud. Quentin's hair was fully gray now, but he was still strong, still capable of a full day's work in the forest. He moved a bit slower than he used to, and sometimes his joints ached in the cold, but he was healthy and vital and still looked at Katherine with the same love that had been in his eyes 29 years ago. "We are getting old," Katherine said one night as they lay in bed, listening to the wind outside. "We are," Quentin agreed, "but we are getting old together. That's all I ever wanted." The winters seemed harder as they aged, or perhaps they were simply less able to handle them with ease. But they had their children nearby now, James and Thomas both checking on them regularly, making sure they had enough firewood and supplies. It was strange, Katherine thought, to be the one being taken care of instead of doing the caring. Sarah visited often with her 2 children, bringing news from town and books for Katherine to read. The schoolhouse was thriving, and Sarah had become a respected figure in Nevada. She had her mother's determination and her father's quiet strength, and Katherine was immensely proud of her. When Katherine was 52, she woke one winter morning to find Quentin struggling to catch his breath. He tried to wave off her concern, said it was nothing, but she could see the fear in his eyes. She sent Thomas for the doctor in town, and for the next week, the whole family held their collective breath while Quentin fought through a lung ailment that the doctor said could have easily killed him. But Quentin was strong, stubborn, and not ready to leave his family. He recovered slowly, and by spring he was back on his feet, though Katherine noticed he tired more easily now and was content to let his sons handle more of the heavy work. "I am not ready for you to die," Katherine told him fiercely one night, holding him close. "Good, because I am not planning on it any time soon. I have too much to live for." They celebrated their 30th anniversary in November, surrounded by their children and grandchildren in the original cabin that had started it all. Someone had brought a cake from town, and someone else had brought a fiddle, and they spent the evening in music and laughter and love. Katherine danced with Quentin the way they had at their wedding, though both of them moved slower now, and she thought about everything that those 30 years had held. "Thank you," Quentin said as they swayed together. "For what?" "For saying yes, to walking with me that first day, to courting me, to marrying me, to building this life with me." His eyes were bright with emotion. "For everything, Katherine. Thank you for everything." "The bear brought us together," Katherine said, "but we chose each other. Every day since then, we have chosen each other. And I would choose you again every time." They continued to age gracefully, continuing to live in the cabin that had seen so much of their life. The grandchildren came often, and Quentin taught them the same skills he had taught his own children: how to track, how to hunt, how to respect the wilderness. Katherine taught them to read and bake and mend, passing down the skills her own mother had taught her. James and Mary had 3 children eventually, all boys who looked remarkably like their grandfather. Sarah and David had 2, a boy and a girl, both of whom inherited their mother's fierce intelligence. Thomas and Rebecca had 4, and their cabin had to be expanded twice to accommodate everyone. Katherine was 58 when she became a great-grandmother for the first time, James's eldest son having married young and started his own family. She held the baby and thought about the miracle of it all, how a chance encounter with a bear had led to this. 4 generations, all connected by love and choice and the stubborn determination to build something lasting. "We did good," Quentin said, watching her with the baby. "We did," Katherine smiled at him. "We did very good." They were in their 60s when Quentin finally admitted that the winters were getting too hard for him. His lungs had never fully recovered from that illness years ago, and the cold bothered him more each year. For the first time, they talked seriously about possibly wintering in town, staying with Sarah and David during the worst months. But when push came to shove, neither of them could bring themselves to leave the mountain for that long. This was their home, the place they had built together. They would face the winters here as they had faced everything else, together. Katherine was 63 when she realized that her own health was starting to fail. It was nothing dramatic, just a slow fading of energy, a tiredness that sleep did not cure. The doctor said it was her heart, that it was simply wearing out after all these years. There was nothing to be done but rest and take things easy. "How long?" Quentin asked the doctor, his voice tight. "Could be years, could be months. No way to know for sure." Quentin became fiercely protective, insisting Katherine rest more, hovering over her constantly. She tolerated it because she knew it came from love, but also because secretly she was frightened. She was not ready to leave him, not ready to leave this life they had built. "Promise me something," she said one night as they sat by the fireplace. "Anything. When I am gone, do not shut yourself away up here. Keep seeing the children and grandchildren. Keep living." "Katherine, I do not want to talk about this." "I know, but I need to say it. You taught me what it meant to truly live, Quentin, what it meant to choose joy and love even when things were hard. I need to know you will keep doing that, even without me." "There is no me without you," Quentin said roughly. "You are part of every single thing about who I am. And I will still be, even when I'm gone. But you have to promise me you will keep living." "I promise," he finally said, "but you are not leaving anytime soon. You are too stubborn." Katherine laughed, and it turned into a cough, and Quentin held her until it passed. She made it through another winter and another spring. Her 65th birthday came and went, celebrated quietly with just Quentin and the children who could make it up the mountain. She was weaker now, spent most days in the rocking chair by the window, watching the seasons change and remembering. "Tell me again," she said one afternoon when it was just her and Quentin, "about the day we met." "You were picking berries," Quentin began, and she closed her eyes and listened to his deep voice painting the picture. "You wore a blue dress and you had berry juice on your fingers. The bear came out of nowhere and you froze, and I thought you were the bravest thing I had ever seen." I was terrified. "Brave and terrified are not opposites. You can be both." He took her hand. "You were both that day, and you have been both every day since. I love you, Quentin Walker. I have loved you since that day, and I will love you beyond this life. I love you too, Katherine. Always." She passed away on a warm day in June, sitting in her rocking chair with Quentin beside her, looking out at the mountains she had loved. One moment she was there, the next she was simply gone, peaceful and quiet and ready. Quentin kept his promise. Though the grief nearly broke him, though there were days he did not know how to keep breathing without her, he kept living. He stayed in the cabin they had built together, surrounded by their children and grandchildren who made sure he was never alone for long. He taught his great-grandchildren the same skills he had taught everyone else. He told stories about Katherine, keeping her memory alive and vivid. He lived 4 more years, and they were good years in their way, full of family and love and the knowledge that he had kept his promise to her. When he finally passed away at 75, it was in his sleep, in the bed he had shared with Katherine for 33 years, in the cabin he had built with his own hands all those decades ago. They buried him next to Katherine on the ridge above the cabin, where they had stood so many times looking out at the valley. The family gathered, 4 generations strong, all of them products of a chance encounter between a woman picking berries and a man who stepped between her and a bear. James stood at the grave with his arm around his own grandson and looked out at the sprawling family that had come from that moment. "They built something lasting," he said. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her weathered face. "They built it out of love and choice and never giving up. That is what they taught us." "That is what we pass on," Thomas added, holding his wife close. The mountain cabin remained in the family, passed down through the generations, always occupied by someone who loved it as Katherine and Quentin had loved it. The story of how they met became family legend, told and retold until everyone knew it by heart. The great-great-grandchildren heard about the bear and the berries and the mountain man who became their ancestor. But more than the story, the family carried forward the legacy of what Katherine and Quentin had built, the commitment to each other, the willingness to face challenges together, the understanding that love was a choice you made every single day. They had taken a moment of danger and transformed it into something beautiful that lasted long beyond their own lives. On the ridge above the cabin, 2 simple wooden markers stood side by side, weathered by decades of mountain weather. "Katherine Finley Walker," they read, and "Quentin Thomas Walker. Beloved wife and husband, parents, grandparents, and the foundation of everything that came after." And in the cabin below, their great-great-granddaughter, Rebecca, rocked her own newborn son and told him the story of his ancestors, of the bear and the berries, and the love that had started it all. The baby could not understand the words yet, but he would, in time. They all did, eventually. It was part of being a walker, part of being descended from the mountain man and the woman brave enough to love him. The mountains stood eternal and unchanging, witness to it all. The same creek ran behind the cabin, the same wind whistled through the pines, the same sky arched overhead. And in the cabin, love continued, generation after generation, all of it stemming from a single moment when a man decided to step between a woman and a bear, and in doing so, stepped into the rest of his life. The story became woven into the very fabric of the family, but also into the fabric of Nevada, Missouri itself. When people in town talked about true love, about commitment, about building something that lasted, they pointed to the Walker family up in the mountains. Young couples starting out would sometimes make the journey up to see the old cabin, to stand where Katherine and Quentin had built their life, as if some of that enduring love might rub off on them. The ridge where Katherine and Quentin were buried became a sacred place for the family. Every year on their anniversary, as many of the family as could make it would gather there, bringing wildflowers in summer or evergreen boughs in winter. They would tell stories, share memories, and recommit themselves to the values their ancestors had lived by. Sarah's daughter became a writer and penned a book about her grandparents' story. It was published when she was 40, a slim volume that captured not just the drama of their meeting, but the quiet beauty of their everyday love. The book sold modestly, but the letters that came from readers told her she had captured something universal. The truth that real love was built not in grand gestures, but in 10,000 small choices to stay, to care, to show up day after day. The cabin itself was maintained with loving care, each generation adding their own touches while respecting the bones of what Quentin had built. The original room remained almost exactly as it had been, a sort of museum to Katherine and Quentin's life. The rocking chair where Katherine had spent her final days sat by the window. The table Quentin had made still stood solid in the center of the room, and on the mantel above the fireplace sat a small basket, replica of the one Katherine had been carrying that day with the bear. As decades turned to a century, the family remained strong. There were struggles, of course. Not every marriage was as solid as Katherine and Quentin's had been. Not every child stayed close to the mountain. But the core remained. The understanding that family mattered, that love was worth fighting for, that the wilderness could be a home if you had the courage to make it one. James's great-grandson, another Quentin, became a wilderness guide, leading tourists through the Missouri mountains and telling them about the land his ancestors had loved. He met his wife on one of those tours, a woman from St. Louis, who fell in love with both the mountains and the man showing them to her. They married and added another cabin to the family compound, and the cycle continued. Sarah's line produced teachers and preachers, and one poet who won prizes for her verses about the landscape of home. Thomas's descendants were ranchers and trappers and wilderness experts, each generation teaching the next the skills Quentin had passed down. The family tree sprawled and branched, but the roots held firm in Missouri soil. On the 150th anniversary of Katherine and Quentin's first meeting, the family held a massive reunion. Nearly 200 people descended on Nevada, Missouri, all of them able to trace their lineage back to a woman picking berries and a man who had stepped between her and danger. They rented out the church for a dinner, covered the walls with family photos and documents, and spent the weekend celebrating their shared heritage. The oldest family member present was James's granddaughter, now 97 years old, who had known Quentin before he died. She stood before the assembled family, her voice quavering but clear, and told them what she remembered. "He was the kindest man I ever knew," she said. "Strong, yes, and capable, but so gentle. And when he talked about my great-grandmother Katherine, even years after she was gone, his whole face would light up. That is what I want you all to remember. That kind of love is possible. That kind of partnership is real. They proved it, and every generation since has proved it again." The applause was thunderous, and there was not a dry eye in the room. That night, a smaller group made the trek up to the ridge in the darkness, carrying lanterns to light their way. They stood by the graves of Katherine and Quentin and looked out over the valley where lights from the family cabins twinkled like earthbound stars. Someone started singing an old hymn, and others joined in, their voices carrying across the mountain night. "They would be proud," someone said when the singing ended. "They would be amazed," someone else responded. All of this from one moment of courage. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps that was the lesson embedded in the story that every Walker child learned. One moment of courage, one choice to step forward instead of back, one decision to love despite risk, could ripple forward through time in ways you could never imagine. Katherine could never have known, standing in that clearing with a bear between her and survival, that her terror would transform into a legacy that touched hundreds of lives. Quentin could never have known, stepping between her and the beast, that he was stepping into a love that would echo through generations. But that was the nature of love the family understood. you could not know where it would lead. You could only trust that it was worth the journey. As the years continued to pass, the story remained alive. Great-great-great-grandchildren learned about Katherine and Quentin the way other children learned fairy tales. Except this story was true. This story had happened to their ancestors in these very mountains, in a cabin that still stood and could still be visited. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the light slanted golden through the trees, people swore they could feel something in that cabin, something warm and peaceful and enduring. Whether it was memory or something more, no one could say. But everyone who spent time there came away with the same feeling, that love had soaked into the wood and stone of the place, that Katherine and Quentin's devotion to each other had somehow become part of the mountain itself. The cabin on the ridge, the graves overlooking the valley, the family that spread across the country but always came home to Missouri, all of it was testament to a simple truth that Katherine and Quentin had understood instinctively. That love was not something that happened to you, but something you built, day by day, choice by choice, with your hands and your heart and your unwavering commitment to another person. The bear that had brought them together was long dead, of course, its bones dust somewhere in the Missouri wilderness. But the love it had inadvertently sparked lived on, growing stronger with each passing year, each new generation, each couple who looked at each other and thought, "I want what they had." And they could have it, the family knew. Anyone could if they were willing to do the work, to make the choice, to step forward with courage when fear said to run. Katherine and Quentin had shown them how. Now it was up to each new generation to carry that lesson forward, to add their own chapter to the family story, to prove again that love built on solid ground could withstand any storm. The mountains stood witness, as they always had and always would. The creek continued its eternal song. The seasons turned, winter to spring to summer to fall and back again. And in the heart of it all, a cabin stood, built by two hands long gone but maintained by love that would never fade. Inside, another generation was beginning, another story was starting, another love was taking root. And somewhere, beyond the veil that separates this world from whatever comes next, Katherine and Quentin Walker looked on and smiled.